Good evening, welcome. My name is Mary Beth McKee. I'm with the Center for Academic Excellence, and I am excited to see all of you here this evening. So whether you came because you knew this was going to be a fabulous talk about a relevant topic for all of us, or if you came for extra credit, we're not judgy. I'm just glad you're here. Last spring, I was reading a book and came across Algorithms of Oppression. It was an algorithm that brought us all here tonight. I was researching a book and it said on Amazon, people who read this book like this one, Amazon got it right. So whatever we say about algorithms, sometimes they're good. So thank you. After reading the book, to be clear, I'm an As You Learn administrator. Finding cool speakers really is not my gig, but it worked out well this time for all of us. And I went to different people and said, essentially passing the hat, saying, there's a really good speaker, I'd love to bring her to campus. And if you haven't hugged your department chair lately, now might be a good time, because when I put out the hat and I said we need a good speaker, so many chairs stood up and said, count me in. So I just want to give a brief thanks to all the departments in different areas who gave us some cash to make tonight happen. The University Forum Lecture Series, the Center for Academic Excellence, the Inclusive Excellence Program, Belk Library and Information Commons, App TV, the Humanities Council, the Department of Marketing, the Department of Leadership and Educational Studies, the Department of Geography and Planning, the Department of Philosophy and Religion, the Department of Communication, the Department of Physics and Astronomy, the Department of Recreation Management, the Department of Social Work, and the Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program. Dr. Noble is an associate professor at UCLA in the departments of Information Studies and African American Studies, and a visiting faculty member to the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication. She is the author of the best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines, entitled Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. Dr. Noble is a professor and a researcher and a writer, and I hope tonight's talk shines some light on how universities can be that space of exploration, to look at the world that we all live in real ways, because I don't know about you, but I do Google searches and other types of searches every day. The work that she's doing is real, and universities make it possible. Without further ado, I just want to welcome Dr. Safiya Noble.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary Beth. Thank you. So much extra credit being given out tonight, yo. I see what's happening here, and I like it. I just want to say thank you very much for this invitation to speak tonight. I can't imagine a better way to kind of end my book tour for 2019 than to be here with you. This is the last academic research talk that I'm giving at a university for the rest of the year, so I'm very thrilled that it's here with you. And, you know, this community isn't that unlike the community that I grew up in. I grew up in Fresno, California, which is a kind of a rural city, a city surrounded by all kinds of agribusiness, and a place that in many ways is lost between Los Angeles and the Bay Area, a place that people sometimes maybe have written off. And so I'm excited to be here, because as I was coming in, I had a wonderful staff member, Tom, who was driving me in and was sharing with me so many things about this community, and I just felt like we share some things in common. I went to Fresno State. I grew up in Fresno, went to Fresno State. I went to San Jose State to do graduate work, and then went to work in corporate America for about 15 years before I ended up going back to graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, mostly to atone for my sins, quite frankly, of working in advertising. I mean, the Hummers, that was me, I'm sorry. Plenty of booze came through my PowerPoints. in terms of working on Fortune 100 brands and products and services over the course of my career. And so this is really what brought me, in fact, to the things that I'm studying. And I want to just kind of give you that little bit of background. When I first started writing about algorithms and technology and how it might be impacting society, this was probably, I guess, early 2010. So almost a decade ago. And it was very difficult back then to get anyone to buy into the idea that technologies could be full of values and in fact could discriminate. In fact, most people thought back then that technology is just a tool. And if it's not working, it's our fault as users. And so I'm going to try to maybe dispel some of those myths. A lot of things have happened over the past 9 years, not, part of which includes the writing of this book, but also a number of critical feminist scholars of color, journalists in particular, have started to write much more about kind of what's at stake with a variety of the platforms that we're using. And of course, the tech sector themselves have been blowing it, I mean, quite frankly. And so that's also been a way that we've come into greater awareness about some of the things that are happening in the industry. One of the things that I felt about writing this book and kind of this research was to highlight the many cases of what I think of as algorithmically data-driven failures. And so I'm going to talk you through just a very, very small sample of examples that are from the book. There's just not enough time to go through all of them. Taken together, I really kind of coined this term algorithmic oppression. And I'm thinking about things like technological redlining. So before we had the internet, we had systems of redlining, systems of discrimination, particularly in the finance and insurance industries. Now, so many of the ways in which predictive analytics work is that they are also profiling us and sorting us and categorizing us in ways that are not entirely visible to us. And so these are the things that we're going to go on a little bit of a journey with tonight. The other thing I want to say is most of my students get real upset when I start talking about Google. It's like I'm talking about their mama. That might be you tonight. I want you to just ride the wave of emotions, okay? Stay with us. No matter what technologies you use, and people ask me all the time if I use Google, and of course, because I work at UCLA and Google runs our IT backbone, so whether I want to or not, I'm always having to engage with the platform. But I think that we deserve to take a closer look and scrutinize the kinds of engagements that we're asked to do. Sometimes we have a choice. Some people feel like, you can just quit Facebook, let's say, or quit a platform. Others of us know that these are structural issues that really can't be resolved at the individual level of choice. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll try to leave some time. If anything, I think I have felt like over the years we've been in a bit of a crisis of consciousness about our technologies. And so it's really exciting to see a whole new crop of students who are interested in studying these things. If you are interested in these things, I would implore you to go to graduate school and spend time. Apply to UCLA. I can just call me. I'll tell you all the good places to apply if you want to do this kind of work, because I think that it's we need more voices and we need you engaged with us in these projects. All right, so let's talk through some of the things that we've seen. First of all, one of my favorite headlines here was 2017 was the year we fell out of love with algorithms, and I can't take credit for that, but man, I really try to lay up on that so much and say that talking about and writing about the ways in which technologies could discriminate is very important. And of course, a decade ago, algorithms were seemingly benign. They were meaningless. They were kind of couched as mathematical formulations. You had to be a programmer or an applied mathematician or an engineer to even understand what an algorithm is. Now, my mother-in-law is like, Saf, what's up with the algorithms? The algorithms are tracking me. And, I feel like I'm not sure if she always knows what she's talking about, but she knows that word. That's her word now. And you're not going to take it from her. So we've moved these words out into the public, and we can all kind of grab a hold of them. And so I think we want to think about a framework for what algorithmic practices exist. And of course, we know that these technologies are designed by humans, and humans program and code all of their biases right into the technologies that they're working through. I've been writing more recently about robots and robotics, and so some of that work will be coming out in the next year. And if you think that this talk is a downer or depressing, wait till you hear about robots. That's all I can say. No, it's not going to be a good situation. All right. In 2018, news coverage of Cambridge Analytica's exploitation and manipulation of Facebook data and its role in undermining democratic electoral politics in the US and in the United Kingdom seemingly ushered in a new era of mainstream critical coverage about the overreach of technical systems into the everyday lives of citizens, consumers, voters, residents. Even though critical academic and journalistic inquiry into algorithmic bias and discrimination had been documented for well over 2 decades or more by, again, scholars of color, LGBTQ, and non-traditional scholars as part of a larger community of critical theorists of the internet, the stories of the year centered around mounting examples and evidence of Facebook's pervasive power and invasions of consumer privacy. Those stories also included stories about Google's failure to address regulators' concerns of monopoly control in search and public concern over the use and disparate risks and harms of AI and emerging technologies. Examples of the failures and risky applications of AI tools included facial recognition systems by militaries and law enforcement organizations, criminal sentencing algorithms within the US legal system, and autonomous vehicles disproportionately trained to only identify white or light skin versus non-white bodies as pedestrians. The volume and salience of these negative and investigative inquiries into the operation and impacts of Silicon Valley tech giants even led the Financial Times to include Techlash within their Word of the Year series in 2018. And you can use that Techlash, you just take it tonight, take it into the future, because I think we're going to see more and more of the kind of critical engagement. In fact, a few of us, a few faculty of your professors and I were having dinner, and one of the questions was, what do you see as different teaching students today versus, say, a decade ago? And I said, what I see today with undergraduate students in particular is that they are so much more open to understanding and seeing the ways in which the technologies they're engaging with are harmful. So it may not be that you specifically identify with some of the examples that you see here, but people are beginning to really understand, students in particular, the kind of invasions of privacy that are happening. I'll give you one example. If you use any kind of learning management system here, is it Moodle? Do you call it Moodle here? Okay, so we call it Moodle at other places too. And one of the things, for example, that I try to teach my students on the first couple class sessions is how Moodle works in surveilling them. So, all the emails that you send where you're like, hey, Professor Noble, see what had happened was I did the readings, but I didn't get my reflection paper in on time, and so can I just, get it in a couple days? And then I go in and I see you haven't logged into the Moodle for 16 days, and so that's not quite right. I also saw you didn't click on the reading, you didn't download it, because the LMS will tell us that. So that's a pro tip for you tonight. I know many of your professors right now hate me, but I think you should know. I think you should know these kinds of things are happening. So people are becoming more and more aware of how these kind of systems of surveillance are working, and I think it's important because the implications for this grow exponentially after you leave a learning management system at the university. Here's a story you might have seen. This was DeRay McKesson. Some of you may know DeRay. He's kind of a well-known activist online on Twitter. I think only the professors are left on Twitter these days. I don't know. I don't think anybody else is on Twitter. But here's DeRay. He became very well known around the uprising in Ferguson in response to the death of Mike Brown, the killing of Mike Brown by law enforcement. He mostly was known, it kind of became overnight well known because Beyonce followed him. And then he got like 500,000 followers. So I feel compelled to say, if anyone here knows Beyonce, and you want to get her to follow me on any platform, it would really amplify the work. So, and strictly for the work. So here's DeRay. He tweets out, he catches the story, and he says, if you Google Map, now this was during the administration, the Obama administration, when President Barack Obama was in the White House. And he tweets out, if you Google Map the N-word house, this is what you'll find. And what was happening is that Google Maps, when you typed in the N-word house or the N-word king, Google Maps would take you to the White House. And this is during the administration of Barack Obama. And when this story broke, the Washington Post picked it up, so did US News and World Report, and the way that it was characterized to me was so interesting. And this is a very kind of standard big tech response. In this case, their spokesperson said, some inappropriate results are surfacing in Google Maps that should not be. We apologize for any offense this may have caused, a Google spokesperson told US News in an email late Tuesday. Our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. There's kind of two things happening here. First, there's the apology, non-apology. So, my husband really hates that I tell this joke, but it's just so funny to me. And I do laugh at my own jokes. So he says, I say, if he says to me, I'm sorry if you were offended, I really don't feel apologized to, because that's not it. Because you offended me. So you don't need to be like, if you were offended, I was offended. So just own it. All right, so there's like a non-ownership of the offense. As if maybe only a couple of people out there are offended that the N-word house takes you to where Barack Obama and the first family are living. All right, the second more important dimension of this non-apology apology is our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. Now this is much more likely, and this is in the spirit of the kinds of apologies we often see launched by big tech companies, which is, this was a momentary glitch, it's temporary, in an otherwise perfect operating system. So that's the logic behind where our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. And of course, one of the things we know, those of us who study the internet, is that many of the kinds of logics that undergird their products and services that can be gamed, in this case, as you can see, by kind of white supremacists or white nationalists, cannot be fixed quickly. Because if they could be, they wouldn't happen over and over and over and over and over again. And this is one of the problems that, of course, tech companies are facing. So I think these are some of the things to think about when we kind of characterize our systems as having glitches, and that we think that AI or artificial intelligence offers us so much that's better than what humans could offer us. And I think this is something that's interesting. So here you have processes that I'm going to show you tonight that are about human beings encoding particular sets of values, or maybe not being careful about the values that they are encoding, or negligent, or not noticing the kinds of values. So we have humans encoding ideas, and then we call that artificial intelligence, and we believe in it as a more stable than our own beliefs and our own abilities. And I call this in the book a technological mediation of ourselves. And it's interesting because as this happens, it really removes a lot of accountability. I mean, who's ultimately responsible? If you talk to Google and their engineers who work in their kind of AI labs and in their kind of on their search algorithms, we're talking about more than 10 years worth of code, thousands of people who've worked on that code. Which piece of the code is it? Who wrote it? Who's responsible? I mean, these are the kinds of complexities when we talk about an accountability that then we shrug off or can no longer hold folks to account to. These are some of the kinds of questions that I think critical internet scholars are asking. So let's talk about some more examples. Here's Kabir Ali, who was a teenager these are screenshots of a video that he posted to Twitter. The first screenshot is a video of him where he's talking to his friends and he's like, let's do a search on 3 black teenagers. And what he gets when he searches on 3 black teenagers is he does a Google image search are almost exclusively mugshots, these kind of criminalized images of black men, young black men. And then he says to his friend, let's see what happens when we change one word, black to white. And then you have this really interesting kind of perfectly curated Getty images of white teenagers seemingly playing multiple sports at one time. It's confusing, in a perfect white background that no one's ever been in front of. So there's this kind of curated idea or sensibility about what white teenagerdom is relative to black teenagerdom. And these are the kinds of things that, these stories abound. They're everywhere. And of course, this is a very interesting problem. Now, the next day, first of all, everyone here knows, don't do anything because someone on Twitter is going to find it out. All right, so the next day, @Bob's Burgers guy on Twitter finds that rather than, in this case of Kabir Ali's discovery, rather than issuing an apology like it has done for the Obama administration, it just quietly changes one image. It adds an image of a young white man in court. He's being sentenced, in fact. Okay, so in some ways, it's confirming the notion that the 3 black teenagers as criminals was appropriate, and once in a while, once in a while, white teenagers commit a crime. So we'll just throw that in there. And then, it also tries to do some modification of the 3 black teenagers. Now, what's interesting is this photo. If you don't know, this is Durley Paul Dedman here, who was sentenced to 50 years in a federal prison after pleading guilty to the capital murder of John Craig Anderson in Jackson, Mississippi in 2011. This is a person who accosted an African-American man and then drug him to death with his car and murdered him as a hate crime. So I think this is also an interesting way in which if you study media discourses or you study communications, you study visual images, this conception of criminality is so extreme also versus the kind of normalized everyday criminalization of African American teenagers. And I think this is, again, did you know you could get a degree in studying these kinds of things? It's quite amazing. So you should check out the faculty in the comm department because we like to teach these things. All right, so this is the study that really kicked off the book. And what was happening again, as I left industry and was coming back into graduate school, one of the things that I saw was that many people were talking about Google like it was, the people's search engine. In fact, recently I was just talking to a librarian maybe 6 months ago, and after my talk, and she was like, I thought Google was a nonprofit all these years. So I don't know how that happened, but we worked it out. We got her straight. After that, it was tough. All right, so one of the things that I was noticing here is I was thinking about what it means in the ways that people and communities get characterized and mischaracterized and really profoundly disrespected in the ways in which they're represented in search. I did a kind of a careful study. I used, unfortunately, kind of gender binaries. I used the census categories. So the gender classification categories that were there, because these are the kind of common categories that were in use at the time that I was doing the study. And then I also kind of crossed that with a variety of the ethnic and racial categories that are listed on the census. And the thing that struck me over and over is that when you intersected girls of color, so black girls, Asian girls, Latina girls, you were almost exclusively met with pornography. So in this slide, you can see this is 2011. This was the same in 2009. The majority of these websites are porn sites. There is this kind of second Black Girls hit, which is a UK band of white guys who call themselves the Black Girls. Has anybody ever heard of them? No one. Even when I'm in the UK, they're like, I don't know who that is, and that's weird to us. So, here are the Black Girls. The band has kind of second billing, and then their Facebook page shows up a little bit later, and then there's a blog at the very end. But all the rest of the sites are these kind of pornographic misrepresentations of Black girls. And I thought to myself, here I was a Black girl at one time in my life. I have a daughter. I have a whole host of nieces. How would we ever be able to compete with these kinds of misrepresentations? And one of the things that people often say to me is that search is simply just a matter of what's most popular. Some of you were actually holding on to that question and waiting for the Q&A so you could say to me, Professor Noble, but isn't search just a reflection of society? And the answer is not entirely. Because society, first of all, is not a monolith. And what happens to people who are minoritized in a population? What happens to people who will never have the force of the weight of the majority to be represented fairly? So in some sense, you could say that yes, people looking for pornographic representations of Black women, and of course, at a most fundamental kind of like gender studies, sexism 101, all of these porn sites are of women, and women get coded as girls. So it's just like we would have covered that on day one in a gender studies class, like what, the logics of that. So here you have kind of what this shows is these intersecting relationships between both what people are searching for, but more importantly, who has the capital, who has the money to control the narratives. And, if you didn't know, the porn industry actually has more money than everybody. They have a lot of money. Many of the technologies that you take for granted every day were really heavily invested in by that industry. Credit card processing, video compression. Back in the day, because I'm super old, it maybe took an hour to load a photo, if you were lucky, on dial-up. Now, the instant kind of nature of the way that, kind of deep media, visual media can circulate, a lot of investment from the porn industry in that, because obviously it's in their interest. So if you're interested in thinking about these things in a scholarly way, there are kind of three main domains that I was taking in. I was thinking about the social construction of technology, which is a field that you might be interested in. One of the things that the kind of Scott theorists are talking about, we learn in other classes that gender is a social construction, that race is a social construction. The Scott theorists are taking on all the ways that technology is also a social construction. And these are the kinds of things that we're looking at. I was interested in how Black feminism, in particular, and critical race theory intersected with our inquiries about technology. And quite frankly, at the time that I started writing this, there were not very many people thinking about Black feminism and technology. And so now people are writing dissertations and doing degrees and really focusing on Black feminist thought and theories, and it's fantastic. And I would encourage people to consider, the orientations, the intellectual traditions, and bringing those into conversation in these interdisciplinary ways. Now, so this is what's happening with vulnerable communities that I think of as, girls of color. But then you have, for years I was talking about this work as I was working on the book. Then you have the same kinds of logics that start to impact electoral politics. So here we have Epstein and Robertson, who do a study in 2013. And in their controlled study, they showed people positive stories or negative stories about political candidates. And when they showed people positive stories on the front page of search about a political candidate, people said, I'm voting for that person. And when they showed people negative stories about a political candidate, they said, I'm not voting for that person. And Epstein and Robertson argue that search should be regulated because people use it as a public information resource. to help them do things like decide how to vote. Now, their study is really important because they concluded that, quote, the outcomes of real elections, especially tight races, can conceivably be determined by the strategic manipulation of search engine rankings, and that manipulation can be accomplished without people being aware of it. They say, we speculate that unregulated search engines could pose a serious threat to the democratic system of government. And this, of course, was consistent with other scholars like Matthew Hinman, who wrote a great book called The Myth of Digital Democracy, where he blew apart the argument that the internet is democratic and showed that, in fact, those who have the most money, particularly in politics, political action committees with the most money, always win in terms of getting their message out. And yet, while that's happening, we're doing searches thinking that we're getting some type of, I don't know, where do we think the vetting is happening? Who do we think is deciding what should get to the first page? Many people use search engines uncritically. They don't really think about how a result got to the first space. I know that not this crowd, because you're very sophisticated. I know you're dipping into like page 13. But I'll tell you that the rest of the public is only looking at the first page. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about, that these kinds of results don't always just reflect the broad participation of users, but instead often are prioritizing the interests of the elites. Now, here's a challenge, because this was all kind of a bit of a foreshadowing to the 2016 presidential election, both their work, my work, other people's work. And here we have the week following the presidential election, we see that the first hit when you do a search in Google on final election results takes you to a disinformation site that reports out that Donald Trump has won the popular vote. Now, it doesn't really matter to me. I mean, it does, but I have to say, when I'm in public, that it doesn't matter to me how you vote or who you stand with. But I will say that facts do matter in the mix of it. So we can't just decide retroactively that somebody won a popular vote that didn't win a popular vote, all right? So there still is a vote count. And so we wonder then, we ask ourselves, well, why is the country divided? Why do people have these different experiences of reality? Why do people find different kinds of facts and different kinds of facts? Well, there aren't facts and alternate facts. There's just facts. And so, but people go and they find this is the first hit. What are they supposed to think? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that we're asking. I think they're really important to ask. Now, when you start getting into a more sinister place, you see that there are also very intense orchestrated networks working to destabilize information and to spread disinformation. And some of the ways that that happens is through things like optimizing particular keywords. So here we have white nationalists who have taken over the keywords Boasian anthropology. And this has happened on a number of keywords for many years. If you did a search on the word Jews, the first page would be full of Holocaust denial sites and anti-Semitic websites. They're what Jessie Daniels in her amazing book, Cyber Racism, calls cloaked websites. They kind of look like they might be legit, and then you just do a couple clicks in. But if you're not a sophisticated web user, you might think that they're legitimate websites. So here you have white nationalists who are, again, working in orchestrated efforts to destabilize a lot of different categories, both academically and otherwise. And if you're interested in this, Joan Donovan at Harvard, previously of Data and Society in New York, has written extensively about media manipulation by white nationalists, and it's a fascinating work. Part of the effort is to destabilize the public's trust in news and in facts. And so we need to understand that that we cannot take a kind of a laid back approach, we have to understand that there are actors and organizations deeply invested in destabilizing knowledge, because that it fractures our relationships, it fractures publics, it fractures democracies. And of course, we're still in the messy work of trying to make a democracy work. Now, people often say that search can't be regulated because it's about free speech. And I know that you were thinking, Dr. Noble, I have a question about free speech because isn't the internet about free speech? And so I'm going to answer that for you in advance. The internet is not a free speech zone, particularly in commercial platforms that have terms of service agreements, they have community guidelines, they have armies of content moderators who are making decisions about what can flourish in those platforms and what has to come down. In the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about how the internet is a free speech zone, except that, and that it can't, that these issues of kind of thinking about the values that circulate in something like search can't be resolved. Except when Google does business in places like Germany and France, where it's against the law to traffic in anti-Semitism or hate speech. And part of that is because I think the Germans and the French have a different, closer, more intimate historical relationship to something like the Holocaust. And they remember, there are people still alive who remember the role that propaganda and disinformation played to lay the ground, to kind of lay down the seeds for creating complete desensitization of a society that could allow the Holocaust to happen right before their eyes. And we might ask ourselves, you know, I live in Los Angeles, where we are really focused and clear and listening constantly to the issues at the southern border and the crisis of what's happening, for example, of children being put in cages and people being separated from their children. And we're intimately connected to these conversations. And, you know, the seeds of disinformation, the sowing of kind of anti-immigrant propaganda in our society really can have it that we could just get up every day and go to work while that happens. And so people always say, you know, I love the memes that go around the internet where everyone's like, civil rights marches, that should have happened in my generation because I would have been on the front lines. And there are a lot of front lines to be on today that we're not necessarily on. And so we should ask ourselves about that. And again, what role the internet is playing either in sensitizing, desensitizing us to the issues at play. Now, I recently wrote a piece for Time magazine that tech companies have been slow to respond to the way their platforms have been used to amplify hate. And part of the challenge is that anonymity on social media platforms often makes it difficult to recognize right-wing radicalization that is happening to some Americans online. And you know, of course, many of you, I'm telling you things you already know because the crossover relationships across platforms, the way in which certain types of actors, you know, participants on the web, celebrities on the web, move through spaces, you know, kind of mostly legitimate. Let's say they're video gamers and they're constantly like playing and kids are watching them. And then they're also just peppering in here and there misogyny or hate speech or anti-Semitism. I had to break a lot of hearts in my house with a handful of 8-year-olds who someone actually accidentally let PewDiePie escape their lips. And I was like, not on my watch. So then I had to break down to the parents all the like work on PewDiePie and his role in really kind of fomenting, bolstering hate online toward women, and that was difficult. And again, some of you are really mad maybe right now that I'm saying that, but these are just facts that we have to kind of reckon with. But of course, these are people who become popular and have a particular kind of celebrity. So these are things that I think we want to notice. I mean, part of the reason that some of these players are so visible to us is because the most titillating, salacious, often hate-filled content, it isn't that it's the most popular in that that's what we want, it's just the most likely to go viral. Even if you don't like it, you might be sharing it with people to say, you know, can you believe that this is happening? And so platforms make a lot of money off of that kind of content. And this is one of the reasons why we have to pay attention to the work that's happening. I think about the work, there's an excellent documentary out right now called The Cleaners. And it's inspired by the work of my colleague, Sarah Roberts, who co-directs the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA with me. And her work looked at this shadow world of content moderators, for example, who are responsible for adjudicating content and pulling things down. And of course, one of the things they're looking for are things like sexual exploitation content, pornography. But they're also adjudicating what they think, is in bounds and what's out of bounds. And one of the things she talks about in her work is she's interviewing Max, who's a respondent to her study, who works for Megatech. I don't know what company that is, you can guess, but he works for Megatech. We're anonymizing the platform, she is. And Max says, I didn't understand why we had to take down all of the violent videos and murders of the drug wars in Mexico and Juarez. Those had to come down out of our platform, but the violent beheadings and videos that were happening in Baghdad could stay up. And so I would ask questions of my managers, and because it was above my pay grade, but I just speculated it somehow weirdly mapped onto US foreign policy. But I'm just a content moderator. I don't know. He'd say, he would go to the weekly team meetings and he would say, I don't understand why the blackface videos get to stay in. How come we're not taking those down? Because those were videos that were profitable in the platform because they circulated a lot. So the politics, again, are really important to understand. And of course, one of the reasons why we didn't know there were commercial content moderators and these people have really just started to come out of the shadows and tell about their work is because that flies in the face of the idea that the internet is a free speech zone. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have it that anything goes, and then also you have hundreds of thousands of people who work for you around the world taking content down or adjudicating content. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be much more aware of. So kind of one last case, and this is a chapter out of the book that really looks at the case of Dylan Stormroof. And many of you may remember Dylan Roof opened fire in Charleston, South Carolina, murdering unsuspecting African Americans who were worshiping at Mother Emanuel AME Episcopal Church. And one of the things that in Dylan Roof's manifesto, again, someone on Twitter immediately found his online diary. And one of the things that as soon as it went public, like within 24 hours, all of us who kind of study race on the internet were trying to figure out Dylan Roof. And we found this this passage, and I kind of put this in the book and wrote about this. So here's Dylan Roof in his own words, in his own online diary. He says, "The event that truly awakened me was a Trayvon Martin case. I kept hearing and seeing his name, and eventually I decided to look him up. I read the Wikipedia article, and right away I was unable to understand what the big deal was. It was obvious that Zimmerman was in the right. But more importantly, this prompted me to type in the words black on white crime into Google, and I have never been the same since that day. The first website I came to was the Council of Conservative Citizens. There were pages upon pages of these brutal black on white murders. I was in disbelief. At this moment, I realized that something was very wrong. How could the news be blowing up the Trayvon Martin case while hundreds of these black on white murders got ignored? From this point, I researched deeper and found out what was happening in Europe. I saw that the same things were happening in England and France and all the other Western European countries. Again, I found myself in disbelief. As an American, we're taught to accept living in the melting pot, and black and other minorities have just as much right to be here as we do, since we're all immigrants." We could double click on that later. But Europe is the homeland of white people, and in many ways the situation is even worse there. From here I found out about the Jewish problem and other issues facing our race, and I can say today that I am completely racially aware. Now, according to the manifesto, Dylan Roof allegedly types in black on white crime into Google search. And what I found incredibly interesting was that the information Roof found to make sense and to kind of cultivate his emerging racial attitudes did not lead him, for example, on the first page to Federal Bureau of Investigation FBI statistics. Now, if you look at violent crime statistics by the FBI, you find that violent crime is an intra-racial phenomenon. So I know you're familiar with the phrase black on black crime, because you hear it all the time. I'm here to offer you white on white crime, Asian on Asian crime, Latino on Latino crime, because most violence happens intra-racially within the same kind of ethnic or racial category. This is not something that you find in the first. And of course now, many of us have been writing about this, talking about this. The Southern Poverty Law Center has written about it as well, and Google has made some modifications to that search. So here we have these kinds of ways that kind of racist red herrings, like black on white crime, which is really a matter of kind of pure disinformation, gets lodged in and controlled by a set of ideologies. And what you don't get are pointed to books that might contextualize the very question that's being asked. Did you know that this is a question or this is a phrase that's mostly used by this list of, let's say, neo-Nazi or white nationalist organizations? No, you don't get the context by which information lives. So I think it's critical that we're thinking about the implications of this. And of course, one of the things I do in the book is I theorize what other kinds of search engines might look like and other types of interfaces. I mean, one of the challenges here is that we have a rank order logic in search engines and even in the libraries and all kinds of information. Of course, we understand the implications of being ranked number one, right? I mean, no one at the game is holding up the foamy finger. We're number 1,395,832. You see, that's not happening. We're either holding up the number one or we're not in the game. All right. So the logics, the cultural logics in our country and around the world are that of the first page in the rank order saying something about validity. Are you low? I've taken you all the way down. They're like, everyone's like, I can't take anymore. But there's more. All right. So one of the things that I think, excuse me, we should be thinking about, of course, are just making these things visible, being able to talk about them, not taking them for granted. I can't tell you how many students I have who say things like, Professor Noble, I could never write a paper without Google. And I'm like, yes, you could have in 1989. And all your professors are like, please don't, because I actually had to use a typewriter. So I don't want to hear it about what you can and can't do, because we wrote papers and they can be written. And there are different kinds of resources and repositories. For sure, you have the library. You have subject matter experts. You're at a university, or you have so many ways to think about your kind of intellectual development and intellectual engagement. And if there were anything that I would share with you that I always share with my own students, it's this idea that everything can be known in 0.03 seconds is a very faulty idea. It's one we need to question. If I ask my students, listen, if everything can be known in 0.03 seconds, why are you at the university? Of course, they're like, to get a job. And I'm like, I know. And I know you're here to get the points. And you don't need to worry about getting the points. You need to worry about getting the critical thinking, right? The ability to interrogate these systems of power and how they work, and to think about interventions upon them. There are many, many ways that we can come to know something. If I took this bottle of water, and I said, tell me what this is, and I held it up in an art and design class, I'd hear a lot about the ergonomics of the design, right? That it's I don't know, it was designed for a child's hand, quite frankly, I don't know, or a small woman, because I feel like I'm crushing this bottle. If I held it up in chemistry, we might have something else. Another way to interpret what this is. It's some H2O in there, it's BPA plastic. I'm definitely giving myself cancer probably right now drinking it. Hope it wasn't in a case in the sun, I don't know. So we might have a point of view about it. If I ask an engineering student, they might be like, what's that? Because I've been on Soylent for 6 months. I don't know, I'm just playing. Okay, so the point is, there are many ways to come to know what something is, and to interpret and to spend time with. And so this idea that you can go to a search engine and just have one answer in 0.03 seconds, I mean, this is a negative kind of acculturation that's happening in our society. It's not worth it, right? It's much more interesting to take a multi-disciplinary approach to kind of understanding and to thinking critically about something. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. Now, for those of, this isn't just for students. This lecture is also for your professors. So now I'm turning to them. You can listen in. One of the things that I think is a challenge, and I've written about this for organizations like EDUCAUSE and authored a piece with, again, with Professor Roberts, we collaborate on a lot of things, is that search engines and algorithmically driven platforms are really a staple of the present information-seeking environment. A lot of students don't feel like they could even live without these kinds of platforms. And they use these platforms, I think, in ways that are not only uncritical, but we're implicated in constantly sending them to these spaces. The kinds of data tracking that are happening around and on students, do we need it? What are the implications of the surveillance? For example, in my classes, we don't put things in Turnitin. That's just a no. It's a no-go for me, because I think to myself, what if my 18-year-old self had papers in Turnitin that I wrote privately to my instructors, to my professors, where my thinking was not where it is today, let's say at almost 50. So it's a lot of hair dye. So here we have, the kind of like exposure that we're potentially putting upon students who are putting their ideas that are not, that are just an experiment, the thought experiments and research, the learning. We have to think about the implications of that. We really have yet to see what will happen with this first generation of students who've documented their entire lives into systems. And when those systems come out, then the outputs, when you want to run for Congress, you want to be a social worker, you want to be a teacher, you want to be a therapist, and then we look back at, let's get a profile, let's get a digital profile of you and all the things you've put into a digital platform, a digital system. Now nobody's going to want to get on the internet tonight. So these are the kinds of things that I think we want to be thinking about, because most of these kind of big data collection and harvesting projects are about predictive analytics, trying to figure out, based on what we know about you today and the things we capture over time, and of course putting those in dialogue with multiple platforms, what we predict about what you'll do tomorrow, or who you'll be tomorrow, or more importantly, what you'll buy, or what we can shape you toward, or what mortgage we can approve or deny, or what college graduate admissions we can approve or deny, or what small business loan you can get, or whether you get to get admission to Harvard because people in your social network wrote some things that the government didn't like, which we just saw happen 2 weeks ago. These are the implications of the massive data kinds of collection and the datafication of students. And I consider students vulnerable populations. These are, we are responsible for kind of protecting the environment for intellectual engagement and thought and growth and learning. They say that the human brain isn't fully developed until you're about 28. So I just say stop stressing. You know what I mean? You could lay back on like, my brain's not fully developed yet, but I don't do that. But it's true. But having the space to think and to develop and cultivate yourself is incredibly important. Last thing I'll say is that, I kind of excerpted a piece of the book for Wired magazine, that social inequality will not be solved by an app. Part of what's happening and part of why we study digital media platforms is because of the constant acculturation to the idea that there's going to be some magic bullet, there's some solution, and it's simple. And it somehow it lives in bits and bytes that's going to solve all of the problems. And I think these are the questions. In fact, the bits and bytes just invite new questions about whether these technologies are implicated in exacerbating social inequality. There was a new study out last spring from the UK House of Commons that said that the 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth by 2030. And I was talking to this girlfriend of mine, she's 30, and I said, what do they think? We're going to watch videos of people eating And she was like, girl, I do that all the time. And some of that food looks really good. And I was like, see, this is not, you're proving my point, okay? You're proving my point. It's not helpful, JD. So these are, again, the kinds of questions we want to ask is what are we being acculturated to? What are we being what are we numb to that we'll just, as long as we kind of get a scrap? It's just not sufficient. And I think we want to resist these ideas of thinking of the constant solutionism. Of course, there was a very important study that just came out about a week ago. It was in the MIT Tech Review about it argued and it studied kind of the biggest artificial intelligence data modeling, and it showed that for the largest kind of AI models that are running, and these are like big Amazon kind of cloud computing models, that running one of those models it kind of outputs the same amount of carbon as 5 cars over the entire lifetime of the car. So, think about if we thought about the internet in these more intersectional ways, and by that I mean with a power analysis about race and gender and class and economics. One of the things that we would do is we would look to see, what's happening in the extraction industries and the kind of exploitation of the minerals that have to be extracted out of the earth to make these devices. Where do they go when we're done with them? I spent last summer in Accra, Ghana, looking at toxic e-waste sites and the kinds of cancerous, poisonous environments when these electronic, we think we put it to the recycling center. It gets loaded up on a barge and it gets sent to the global south, and other people have to deal with the problems of our making and of our support. And so these are the ways we could reimagine thinking about, my computer science students, I say, hey, you want a challenge? I don't want to hear about the Wash app, the app that washes your car, that's really 2 guys who come with a truck full of water and some soap and sponges. That's actually not an app. That's some guys coming to wash your car. All right. These inventions of like great ideas that are app-based solutions that have a whole host of labor involved by people in them. I say, if you want a real design challenge, make this so that when we're done with it, we can eat it. That breaks the room, and then people are very unhappy. Okay, so what are some things we can do? First of all, we've got to reject the idea of neutrality and information brokering in our tech professions. If you're in engineering and computer science, but even if you're just a user of technologies, if you're a librarian, this idea that there's no politics embedded in our technologies is false. And so we've got to really reject these ideas. We need to resist the colorblind kind of racist, sexist ideologies that also undergird. One of the things that's so profound if you study Silicon Valley is you see that it revels in this idea that they're kind of colorblind, that they don't see race, they don't see gender. Except weirdly, they do see like 1 or 2 specific races and gender and 1 gender. So it doesn't map, all right? And part of that is just to, again, avoid having the conversations about the complexities of these systems. We need to fund librarians and archivists. Listen, you have a whole host of people at this university who can help you discover information and who can help you think about knowledge. Knowledge is a slow process. It's iterative. It's one thing if you're just trying to look for banal information, like how do I convert this cup to metric, because I don't know anything about metric, which is most Americans, then you can, then it's very helpful. Although, by the way, we used to look in cookbooks to do that. So it's not like we didn't know before we had the internet how to do that. But you can think about the ways in which, and this is, for provosts and people who fund universities to think about this. And of course, we need librarians and archivists helping us curate the open web and do more sense making there. Of course, we need to reduce the technology overdevelopment and its impact on the people. And I call it overdevelopment because the question is, do we need iPhone 20? Do we? I feel like we're gonna probably be in after 15, don't you need to stop and go to A, B, C? I'm not sure what the logics will be, but these questions have to be asked about this kind of planned obsolescence of our electronics, and then of course our responsibility for where they go. They do come back to us. They come back to us in the form of things like climate change. Quite frankly, if you think that technologies are not implicated in climate change, then I implore you to read the studies of the scholars who are doing doing this kind of work about the massive energy consumption. And Google's offset of its carbon footprint is not enough when we talk about the massive amounts of energy that are being used. And then, ultimately never give up. I'll tell you, people get, really low sometimes when they hear my talks, but I'm gonna say this, and this is gonna be super controversial, particularly in North Carolina. I've only said this once in North Carolina when we were at lunch today, but I will say it. There was a time when we could not imagine, most of you are not, this is for the gray-haired set in the room with me, when we were kids, 4 out of 5 doctors recommended Marlboro or Camel cigarettes. You might get your baby delivered with a big long ash hanging off of a cigarette, or doctor's delivering your baby with like a cherry on the cigarette. This is incomprehensible, I'm sure, for many of you who didn't grow up in the 70s. But for us, we could never imagine a society that wasn't organized around smoking. It was the paradigm. And people would say things like, the economy will collapse if we get rid of smoking, if we ban smoking or we regulate it heavily. And here we are, thriving. So the question is, could we look to other kinds of paradigms and reinvent the technological paradigm that we're working in with more of the kind of research? I mean, I'm just scratching the surface of the kinds of things that are available, but I challenge you to think that there could be paradigm shifts about the environment, about consumer harm, about the harm of vulnerable populations and publics with our engagements, even with our addictions and our distractions and the surveillance. You might not be sympathetic to what happens to vulnerable people because you don't identify with those communities, but I'll tell you, the White House just adopted a new technology. They announced about 3 weeks ago that they were adopting a new technology, a new type of AI that's supposed to help profile mass murderers and domestic terrorists. Who do you think is in the database of mass murderers, and who's the predictive analytic? It's not black women, okay? So I want you to think about these kinds of things. These things are concerning to me. There is no AI that can predict a mass murderer. That does not exist. You can't read your facial expressions and determine whether you're going to be a great employee or not. Maybe something's on the screen and you're squinting at it. Maybe you forgot your glasses today like I did. Now, fail. Terrible employee. I mean, I might be a terrible employee, but that's for different reasons. It's not because of like my facial expressions. But these kinds of technologies are being rolled out in the employment sector, whether you can get a job. These false ideas and what many of us think of as junk science. That is kind of where new markets and hype is being used to sell these through. And I think that everybody has a stake in thinking about these kinds of things. We have more data and technology than ever, and we have more economic and social injustice to go with it. And so these are the kinds of things that I think there's a great opportunity for us to think about reimagining. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.